Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Susan, and I have the privilege this morning of introducing our speaker. Welcome on live stream as well. We have today Professor Alain Sanders, who's going to be talking about the presidency, from clerk to the can-do branch. Alain is the associate professor emeritus of political science at St. Peter's University in Jersey City, and a TV and radio political commentator on domestic and international and political issues. He was a professional journalist for 21 years, working as a senior reporter for Time magazine, writing stories for every major news section of the magazine, including Nation, World, and Law. Please help me welcome Alain Sanders.
Thank you, Susan, for that kind introduction. Can you all hear me? Because I am a professor, so I can yell and shout aloud if the mic does not work. Okay. All right. Well, welcome to this lecture on the presidency. Obviously, it's a topic of great interest at the moment for obvious reasons. So let's start with a simple question. Who was the first president? Are you sure? Who was the first president? George Washington? Really? How about this? Everybody forgets that before we had the Constitution, first of all, we had a regime, what we would call a junta in modern day discourse. And then we had another constitution, the first constitution, the Articles of Confederation. So who was the first president? Not George Washington, I'm sorry. You could have told me John Hancock, who's up there in red, because he happened to be the president of the Continental Congress of the United States of America at the time of independence, which was when? No, which was when? When did we declare independence? Look up there. Yeah, everybody says July the 4th. That's wrong. July the 4th was when the press release was issued. It's called the Declaration of Independence. And I'm giving you this so you get used to the actual language. You know, the Declaration of Independence was a press release to the world explaining what happened on July the 2nd, which was the date that the United States declared independence. That was when the resolution occurred. And the person who happened to be the president of the junta, because if you see up above, presidents of the Continental Congress as the United Colonies of America, the person who happened to be president of that junta was John Hancock. So you might have told me, okay, John Hancock was the first president. Or, if you prefer, because there was no, there was no Constitution on July the 2nd, you might have waited and told me, well, let's wait until the first Constitution, which was called the Articles of Confederation. And the first president of that Constitution, under that Constitution, was Samuel Huntington. Only until you get to 1789 do you see this guy, George Washington, becoming the first president of the United States under the second Constitution of the United States. People forget that we had a first Constitution, and now we're functioning under the second Constitution of the United States. That's a significant thing. We forget about the fact that we had a kind of very messy beginning. You know, people kind of know that. You've heard of the Articles of Confederation, but you kind of forget that they ever existed. But understand that after we declared independence, we had 5 years of a revolutionary government, a junta, if you want to call it that in modern terms, lasted 5 years, and then we had 8 years under the Articles of Confederation. So some 13 years before we get to 1789. You know, people tend to forget that. So why did we have a second Constitution? What happened? Okay? Basically because the first Constitution was a complete failure. And again, we forget that. The founders messed up. They didn't do, and they didn't think through things properly, or at least They did what seemed reasonable to them at this time, but it didn't make sense for a functioning national government. Thank you. Why didn't it work? Because the first Constitution was a Constitution based on states' rights. The states had all the power, and the central government was very weak. It required the collaboration and cooperation, voluntary collaboration and cooperation of the states. The national government could only function through the states. And the states, of course, were very jealous of their sovereignty, and they didn't cooperate very much. The national government had no power to raise money through taxes, had no power to raise troops, had no power to regulate commerce between the states. And so what you found was a totally dysfunctional system that didn't work. It led to financial crises, it led to economic instability, to commercial paralysis, because you couldn't really trade very well between the states, and political and civil disorders. There was mob rule in certain parts of the country at certain times. So the founders had to go back to the drawing board, and they were very concerned about the unrest and the problems of the day. And so they went back to the drawing board, and then you've heard about the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and they produced the second document, the second Constitution, which is the one under which we operate today. And what does it do? It created a strong national government, one that did not rely on the powers of the state. Now, you still had clauses talking about states' rights and so forth, but the national government was an independent government of the states with its own strong independent powers that did not depend on the states. But the government was limited, okay? It was a strong government, independent in its power and its sovereignty, but limited. And the Constitution lays out, you know, what the national government can do and presumably what it cannot do. And it created three branches: a presidency, a Congress, and a court system. Actually, the actual order is a Congress. Article 1 is Congress. Article 2 is the presidency. And then Article 3 is the federal court system. So let's focus on the presidency, because that's what we're here to talk about. If you want to talk about the other branches, we can have other lectures on the other branches, but let's talk about the presidency. So consider for a moment the challenges that the founders had when creating the presidency under the second Constitution. There was no model. There was no model, okay? The only model they were aware of was absolute monarchy in Europe. This was a group of people whose ancestry and background came from Europe. There was no model, only a king. So think about that. How do you go creating an executive branch when the only model you have is a king? And so they kind of had to scratch their heads and think a little bit. And as so many parts of the Constitution, they decided to proceed down a very delicate and really equivocal middle, because they didn't know really what to do, okay? And so they created a presidency, like the Congress, a presidency of enumerated powers. Now, you don't hear that very often, but the presidency, like the Congress, enumerated powers, okay? But also a presidency of constrained powers. They sort of went down the middle, kind of hazy middle. Here are the listed enumerated powers of the president, and here are his constraints. And they wrote it all down in Article 2 in very sparse, terse, and vague language. And it's like so many parts of the Constitution, because what do you do? You don't really know what you're heading into. So terse language, sparse language, vague language at times, which they understood would be filled out over time by the exigencies that the country would go through in the future, its social, political, and economic exigencies. So let's take a look at what the Constitution says of the presidency. There it is. Now, you won't be able to read it because it's so small, but when you take a look at it, you'll understand what I mean about sparse, terse language. That's it. Everything the president does to this day has to be traced back to those words. So let's take a look at them a little bit to give you a little bit of aid. I sort of summarized them in this way for you. So those are the powers of the presidency. That's what every president from George Washington to Donald Trump has to work with constitutionally. Okay, so the president is vested with the executive power. What is it? Your guess is as good as mine, except there are some educated guesses about that. Okay? Presumably, they knew that the monarch was an executive, right? So the president has executive power. Okay, good. We'll talk about that. But let's think a little bit more specifically. He's commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy, not the Air Force. They didn't have an Air Force. So I always bring that up with people who talk to me about strict construction. What about the Air Force? But look at it a little bit more closely from our point of view. Okay, he's commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy, and the Air Force and the Space Command and whatever. Who raises the troops? Congress. If Congress doesn't provide him with an Army, Navy, or Air Force or whatever, the president's commander-in-chief of nothing. Request the opinion in writing of the main officers of the executive departments. Who creates the executive departments? Congress. If Congress doesn't give him executive department, he can require the opinion of nobody. Okay? Grant, repeat, and pardons for federal crime. Now, pardons are a big subject these days, but grant reprieves and pardons for federal crimes. Who creates federal crimes? Congress. If Congress doesn't create any crimes, he can't grant pardons of anything for federal crimes. Okay? Appoint ambassadors, U.S. Supreme Court justices, and all other officers of the federal government whose appointment by the president and confirmation by the Senate is required. If the Senate doesn't confirm, doesn't have ambassadors, doesn't have Supreme Court justices, doesn't have executive officials. Make temporary appointments when the Senate is in recess. But your temporary appointments only last until the Senate's next session, if you do that. Provide information from time to Congress on the State of the Union. Okay, Congress would like to know what you're up to. Recommend legislation to Congress. Does Congress have to pass it? No. So, sorry, nice recommendations, but they're not laws. Call Congress into special emergency session when necessary. Okay. Does it have to do anything? No. Receive ambassadors of foreign countries. Okay, that's okay. You got that. You can bring them over for tea. Commission all officers of the United States. Who creates the officers? Congress. Take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Who passes the laws? Congress. So what am I telling you? For the most part, yes, these are the enumerated powers of the president. But if you read it a different way, these are also the powers of Congress. And the president really can't do much without Congress. So I remind you, if you are unhappy about the president, whether it's this president or prior president or the future president, maybe you should take a look at Congress, not just the president. Because Congress enables the president to do whatever he's going to be doing, at least under these guidelines here of the Constitution. Now, Article 1, Section 7 is under the congressional part, is the one that you know that the president has to approve bills, and the Congress can override his veto. So again, the Congress can override the president's veto. So we're really talking, even in Article 2 here, about the powers of Congress. And that's something that people should never forget, because every time I hear about the election of the president, I say, okay, this one, that one, you prefer this one, you prefer that one. But what about the Congress? And people tend to forget that about the presidency. It's a constrained presidency that depends very much on the powers of Congress. So, okay, let's talk about the first president, because that's what George Washington had to work with, okay? And what did he work with? That language, and he was very conscious of the fact that anything he did would set a precedent, because he understood that the language was sparse and that it was vague, and that whatever he did, people would say, okay, this is what the president is supposed to do. He was a highly respected man, and he understood that. So what did he do? He immediately started interpreting the vague language, okay? And he did it in two general ways. Now, I'm not going to go through his presidency in great detail because I want to get to the modern presidency, but I want you to understand what he understood so that you can then judge that, because when people talk about strict construction or going back, the intent of the framers and whatever, that's the intent of the framers, okay, in terms of the presidency. So what did he do? He believed and he practiced during his presidency on domestic affairs a very restrained presidency. He recommended legislation to Congress because the Constitution says he can do that, but he didn't push his agenda. These were his recommendations, and then he let Congress decide whether those were good, bad, or indifferent recommendations. He applied no pressure to get his programs enacted in general. He believed that the primary duty of the president was to execute whatever Congress decided. He was an executive. You execute whatever the policymakers, and the policymakers are in Congress, decided should be done. So he believed that his primary duty was just to execute what Congress had decided. And this is interesting because many people don't know this. And again, because the language is sparse. He also believed that the veto, which you're all familiar with, should be exercised only when the president thought that the law of Congress was unconstitutional, not when he disagreed with the law of Congress. So again, I'm saying, want to go to original intent? Well, this is what George Washington thought about the veto power, okay? I believe I can only use the veto when I think Congress is doing something unconstitutional. Now, this was a practice, obviously, that was not followed. Subsequent presidents later on decided that they could veto on policy grounds, not on constitutional grounds. But nonetheless, that's the general view of George Washington regarding domestic policy. On foreign policy, however, he did believe in a preeminent presidency in the field of foreign affairs. And again, that was because of his view of the executive power, right? Monarchs conducted foreign policy, and so he believed that that was his duty to carry out foreign policy as well. And so he set a very powerful precedent during his presidency. He simply declared the United States neutral between France and England in a war that was going on between them. And obviously it had some repercussions here in the United States. So he said, we're going to be neutral. Well, that's foreign policy. There it was. And that set a precedent. And then, of course, Supreme Court decisions subsequently elaborated on why the president could do that. But nonetheless, he acted. We're neutral. And that's the American foreign policy. So the idea of a restrained policy on domestic grounds is something of a precedent that he set. And it was a conception of the presidency that really lasted for the first 100 years of the United States. It was followed by most presidents. They were just executives, clerks. And that's why I call it from clerks. They were clerks that carried out the policies of Congress. And that is why you really don't remember most of the presidents of the first 100 years, except a few that stand out that didn't follow this pattern, because this is just a pattern. But most presidents did follow the pattern, and you don't know. I mean, what did Millard Fillmore do? What did Benjamin Harrison do? Nobody knows. You do know Lincoln, and you probably do know about Jefferson, but those were kind of some of the standout presidencies during that period. So what does that mean? President William Howard Taft spelled it out, basically. This notion that the president is the clerk, just carries out what Congress does, led to a conception of the strict construction presidency, which is what it came to be called, and Taft sort of articulated what that means. So if you can read what he wrote about that, it reads this way. The president can exercise no power which cannot be fairly and reasonably traced to some specific grant of power or justly implied and included within such express grant as proper and necessary to its exercise. Such specific grant must be either in the federal Constitution or in an act of Congress passed in pursuance thereof. There is no undefined residuum of power which he can exercise because it seems to him to be in the public interest. Interesting, given our times, okay? The strict construction presidency from a Republican president, William Howard Taft, okay? So that's sort of, gives you the basic rationale as to why the president should be constrained. You can only do what Congress enacted or what the Constitution says in its vague language you can do. So what happened? Because that clearly is not the presidency of today. It's not the presidency of Donald Trump. Wasn't the presidency of Joe Biden, Obama, Clinton, Bush, the two Bushes. It's not. Okay? What happened? Well, the country did not remain static, and that is something people sort of overlook. Okay? The country underwent a major transformation at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. The U.S. economy up to that time, for the most part, had been one of simple, free market economy of small farmers and small firms, merchants. But then, with the Industrial Revolution that came to the United States, the economy was transformed into an industrial, corporate-dominated economy. Major corporation just evolved out of the free market system that was just there. But now the Industrial Revolution made it possible for these huge corporations to develop, and with units so large that the activities of those corporations had large social and political consequences. New relationships were created, relationships between employers and employees in a corporate setting, relationships between sellers and buyers that didn't exist before. And then, of course, for these corporations to thrive, these businesses to thrive, they needed a stable national economy in which to sell and have relationships with consumers. And that stable economy also required that there be stable communications and transportation systems so that these corporations could produce the goods that people wanted, okay, that people wanted. Now, okay, this new economy also created possibilities, wonderful possibilities. We have great benefits from that, but also problems, okay? Things like urbanization. People swarmed to the cities, and all of a sudden, you had large populations in cities that created problems of sanitation, problems of crime, problems of health. There were also workplace and economic issues, like wages. I mean, on a farm, you don't have to deal with wages if it's a family farm. But now, all of a sudden, you have issues pertaining to wages, to industrial safety, to unfair trade practices, to monopolization, to pollution. With people in the cities, there are housing issues and housing problems, disease, education, poverty, pollution, crime, immigration, discrimination. All these issues come to the fore as the U.S. economy transforms itself into a national economy that is primarily industrialized. So what happens? People start to demand laws from their states and from the federal government to address sort of all of these issues that all of a sudden have cropped up that never existed before in large measure. So you get popular demands for state and national laws. So what does that mean at the federal level? It means that Congress starts to pass laws to address these various issues. And as Congress passes laws to address these various issues, who gets to implement them? The President of the United States. He is the one who must execute the laws of Congress. And so all of a sudden, the presidency gets all these responsibilities, all this authority to do things that Congress says, this has to be done, and here are the laws. Please carry them out. And so you get this surge of power that goes to the presidency as a result of all the new responsibilities that he has to execute. And then something else happens in the early 20th century. Horrific wars. World War I and World War II. And then, of course, it continues forward with a war, but a Cold War that had lots of conflicts. So what happens there? The president is commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and so forth, right? And so this provides an impetus for the president to claim and to assert greater power over national security and the use of the U.S. military because he can command them to do things. He's the commander-in-chief. And then Congress facilitates that. It also has power over the military. It has the power to raise the Army and troops. And so Congress passes laws to enable the president to fulfill his duties as commander-in-chief, and those laws proliferate as well. So you've got the president acting on his own as commander-in-chief, and you've got Congress helping him with passing laws during World War I, during World War II, and as we all know, throughout the Cold War. So all of a sudden, you have a presidency that is charged with huge responsibilities on the domestic front and has huge responsibilities and authorities on the foreign affairs front. That's an important development. But no, it comes from Congress, okay, in a large measure. Then what else happens? Congressional delegation of power and executive orders. So you've all heard about executive orders with this president. So what does that mean? I mean, people say, oh, well, the president can pass laws. I had students tell me, well, the president can pass laws. And my response, well, doesn't he have executive orders and pass laws? And my response was no. The president cannot pass laws. But what can he do with executive orders? Well, it comes from this doctrine of congressional delegation of power, for the most part. There are two ways in which the president can issue an executive order. One, he has some constitutional responsibilities. So the most important one is commander-in-chief. He's commander-in-chief. So he can order. He can order things that the military must do. The most famous executive order as commander-in-chief was President Truman's executive order desegregating the armed forces of the United States. He just ordered it. We're desegregating the armed forces. Okay, we're integrating the armed forces. He can do that. So if he's got a very clearly defined constitutional power, he can order that. But for the most part, as you saw, he does not have that kind of power. So where can he claim that power? Congress delegates to him the lawmaking authority. So a congressional delegation of legislative authority is when Congress passes a law delegating, authorizing the president or an executive agency under his authority to issue rules and regulations, which are law. Okay, a rule or regulation is law. But it comes from the fact that Congress has authorized the president to do that. And over the centuries, Congress has authorized many things for the president to do. Okay? And that is the most common source of authority that President Trump has been utilizing. There are these laws lying about that Congress has passed over the years that authorize the president to do things, to issue rules and regulations. And so, in large measure, President Trump and all other presidents before him have done that. Now, the issue comes as to whether what the president is doing is actually authorized by the underlying statute. That's where the controversy is with Trump's orders right now that are the subject of all this controversy. It's not the wisdom of the policy that's at issue. That's for you, the voters, and for me, for us, the voters, to decide whether the policy is wise. The issue for the courts when lawsuits are filed, and many lawsuits have been filed, is whether the president has the authority to do that under the statute, okay? And statutes, like the Constitution, have gaps, vagueness. And so, of course, presidents will go forward on that. With any vagueness they see, they'll try to exploit that and say, well, I can do that. The statute says I can do that. See, Congress passed that. And so that's where the issues are. So when you follow the lawsuits that are filed against the Trump administration, pay attention, okay? It's not the wisdom of the policy. Judges don't do that. Don't decide that. That's for us, the voters. What they decide is, does the president have the authority? Okay. Now, just as an aside, why would Congress do that? Give the president authority. Pass a law and says, you do it, Mr. President. Well, basically because Congress can't do it. Think of how Congress functions. It's 100 senators, 435 representatives. Each comes from a different part of the country with different interests, different constituencies, different problems. It's hard for them to legislate every detail of policy on a daily basis, and legislate that, pass laws. All right, pass laws every single day on every little detail of things that have to work, and when something doesn't work, have to fix it with laws. You know how Congress works. It's very slow. It's an institution that was designed to be slow. So they know they can't do that. So they delegate the authority to the president because the president now can decide very quickly what to do. And of course, he's got executive agencies under him that the Congress has provided with presumed expertise in the various fields of endeavor. And so the agencies and the president don't have the cumbersome process of legislating. They can just issue rules and regulations. There's some restrictions on that, but basically they can act quickly, and the president can act quickly to a problem that arises, okay? So think of something very simple like pollution, okay? So we discover that, a 1% of a particular product or chemical is dangerous to health, which we didn't know before. Well, the president and the executive agencies under him can just change the standard, okay? Congress would have to go through a whole legislative process to change the standard for that pollution problem to be resolved. So Congress just delegates, and that's a source of immense power for presidents, okay? The ability to issue executive orders. Then presidents also have understood something else. They have the power to set the legislative agenda. The Constitution says that the president shall from time to time give to the Congress information on the state of the Union and recommend for their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. Well, modern presidents have understood that to just understand they don't just have to send a piecemeal piece of legislation. They can send a whole program over to the Congress. They can set forth a presidential program. And if they set forth a presidential program to the Congress, they can campaign for election on that presidential program. They can mobilize public opinion and congressional support for that program and submit draft bills to Congress. That's a recommendation. Here's my bill. I ran on it for election. I have a whole program. I have this whole things that I want to do. They can state that forth in a State of the Union message, and they can then run on it previously, during, after, for a second term, and have a whole legislative program. Well, that raises the profile of the presidency all of a sudden. Now you're not just voting for this guy because you think he's competent, or that woman because you think she has a good set of values or programs. You're voting for a program, and that raises the profile of the presidency. And then a small footnote on the State of the Union. It just says, the president shall from time to time, give Congress information on the State of the Union. For most of the country's time, the only thing which is very sparse and vague. So you get the power to set the legislative agenda. And that is linked to the power of the media, the modern media. There were always newspapers, that's for sure. But now we're entering the 20th century where you've got radio. You can actually hear the president. And then we get television. You can actually see the president. And now, of course, we have all of the internet and its various ways in which presidents can communicate either broadly or to very specific audiences using the internet and social media. So what does that do? The president jumps on it. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to jump on it. He actually had reporters watch him shave in the White House. Now that's important because it personalizes the presidency. They understand that by using the media, not only can they project their policies and programs to the world, but they can also develop a relationship with the people, with Congress, with foreign leaders, with anybody they want to strike up a relationship with, and develop trust if they know how to handle the media properly. So you've got the president now on a stage, what Teddy Roosevelt used to call the bully pulpit. And bully pulpit doesn't mean bully in the way you understand it today. You know what bully pulpit stood for? What bully meant back then? Didn't mean be forceful or, be aggressive. Bully was an expression. It meant to be cool, to be great. That's what it was. Teddy Roosevelt used to go around. When he liked something, he used to say, bully, that's cool, that's great. And so because he went around and said bully, it came to be called the bully pulpit, the great stage, the great pulpit, okay? And he understood that. And of course, every president after him, Wilson and so forth, understood that. And understand how they understood that. Woodrow Wilson sort of laid it out, and that's why the media became such a great source of power for presidents. He wrote, the president is the political leader of the nation, or has it in his choice to be. The nation as a whole has chosen him and is conscious that it has no other political spokesman. His is the only national voice in affairs. Let him once win the admiration and confidence of the country, and no other single force can withstand him. No combination of forces will easily overpower him. His position takes the imagination of the country. And with the media, that's what presidents can do. They can project their message, their policies, they can project their personality, they can build trust, and most importantly, they can eclipse the opposition. And that's what Wilson is talking about. No combination of forces will easily overpower him because the president can dominate the public discourse and the public stage, the bully pulpit. That's an immense source of power. How often do you hear congressional opponents of the president speak as loudly as the president? Okay? It's hard. It's very hard. And that's why, many Democrats today say, what are they doing? What are they doing? Well, whether they're doing or not doing, it's hard for their message to be projected because the president dominates, okay? And that's true whether the president is a Republican or a Democrat. Some presidents are more adept at dominating the stage than other presidents, but they all do. And then something that, of course, the framers never anticipated, but which developed very quickly, and that's political parties, okay? The president is the leader of his political party, and he can rely on members for support. Now, of course, if he has majorities in Congress, then of course that's easy. But even when he doesn't have majorities, he dominates, and he is assured at least of a core group of supporters in Congress. And then if he can just win over a couple of people from the other party, he gets his way in terms of legislation, okay? Now, why do members of the president's party support him? I mean, he counts on them. Why do they support him? Well, for one very obvious thing, which many people don't realize, is presumably if you are the president's party, you share his ideology. You share his views. That's why you're a Republican for a Republican president. That's why you're a Democrat for a Democratic president. They share the views, very simply. And then, moreover, they share basically the same coalition of voters that elected the president. Now, it varies. It's not a perfect fit, but generally they have the same coalition. So of course they share the same views basically, and the voters who voted for them are basically the same kind of voters that voted for the president. So they're going to support the president. And then of course there's some very practical considerations. If you have the presidency and you're a member of Congress, you want to support that presidency because you want to make him look good. If you make the president look good by supporting him, then hopefully that will help you in terms of getting reelected. If he looks good, you look good, okay? And then you also want to develop a record of legislative success. If the president can pass laws, you can hang on to that. See, look at what we did working together with the President of the United States. And then, of course, very, very much so, the president can influence your reelection if you're a member of Congress. He can support your bills in Congress, so you can go back and see, I was instrumental in getting this bill passed. He can support your pork barrel projects back home, make sure the funds are there so that they can build a dam or the post office or the highway. The president can help you protect a local industry by either speaking about it or maybe helping you pass a law. And then most importantly, the president can be very active in your reelection. He can endorse you or not. He can deliver speeches, go out of his way to deliver speeches, or have members of his administration go out, various cabinet officers go out and support you. And also he can, of course, help you raise money for your campaign, which is all critical. So that's a power of the presidency, okay? That's another huge power of the presidency. And then the last thing I want to talk about, and it's a little bit vague, but I can give you some precedents if you're interested, and that is the broad interpretation of presidential power by presidents as well about the Supreme Court. The thing is that the Constitution and the powers of the presidency are sparse. I went through them with you at the beginning, right? And somewhat vague. And because of that, presidents have grabbed onto what political scientists, I love this phrase. It's from Richard Pius, who is a professor of political science at Barnard University, or college, Barnard College. And he says, the president can claim the silences of the Constitution. And why? Because the president is in perpetual session. So if there's a gap, and the president can see that gap in his power, and he wants to do something, he's there. Congress is not necessarily there, right? It adjourns regularly. And for good reasons, by the way, that it adjourns. But the president is always there. He's always there. And the presidency is headed by one person that can speak with a united voice. With a united voice. So when the president sees something and he sees that there's an ambiguity there, he can grab onto it. He's there. He can speak with a united voice. Here's what I'm doing. Here's why I'm doing it. Here's what I'm doing, and here's why I'm doing it. And then he's got a whole hierarchy, a whole executive branch that Congress has provided him to actually execute that immediately, if the president gives the order to do so. So presidents can claim the silences of the Constitution. Just go for it whenever there's an issue. And the same thing can be said of statutes. Statutes also have gaps and have holes and silences in them. So whether it's a statute or whether it's a constitution, the president can just act. Now, whether he's acting legally or unconstitutionally or whatever, that's for later. But the president can just act. And so if the president acts and Congress does nothing, it's done. It's a done deal. And it becomes a precedent. See, the president claimed he had power to do this under this statute, or the president claimed he could do this under the Constitution. Congress was there, didn't say nothing, didn't say anything. So clearly the president has the authority to do it. Or if there's no lawsuit that's brought to the Supreme Court ultimately, the Supreme Court doesn't speak on it either. So neither the Congress nor the Supreme Court has spoken on it. The president says, it's part of my executive power. Remember that phrase? It's part of my executive power. And so it becomes a precedent for him and for subsequent presidents. I'm almost done, so I'll answer your question in a second. Now, of course, the Supreme Court, a lawsuit could be brought, and the Supreme Court might rule on the legality of this. And of course, if it doesn't, it says it's illegal, then, okay, then the president presumably cannot do it. But if the court agrees that it is within the president's power, then of course it's clearly a precedent. The president has done it and the Supreme Court has blessed it. Now I'll give you a very simple example from a historical perspective, and then something very short, and then I'll stop and you can ask me questions. So you say, so the president, can claim a gap in the Constitution. Well, it arose in 1890. Okay, which is on the cusp of the 20th century, and you can see how the presidency kind of matures in that era. The issue was that a justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Field, had made some enemies as a result of his legal rulings, and there were assassination threat against him. In fact, there's two very specific people had threatened his life. And the question then arose, as Justice Field went around the country, whether he should have a bodyguard, whether the government should give him a bodyguard. Congress had not passed any statute about bodyguards for Supreme Court justices. But the justice was under a very definite threat. No statute. What does President Benjamin Harrison do? Does he follow the strict construction presidency that our dear friend President Taft said? You don't got any authority. There's no statute for a bodyguard. On the other hand, this is a justice of the Supreme Court, and then he is under very specific threat. So what did President Harrison do? He issued a bodyguard. And thank goodness he did, because the threat materialized. When the two suspects were in the same place with Justice Field, when they were in the same place as a result of a train ride, they tried to assassinate it. They fired a gun, but the bodyguard stopped it, and Field survived. So thank goodness for Justice Field, okay? Whether the Supreme Court approved of that, because the lawsuit was brought, did the president have the authority to issue a bodyguard in the absence of a statute? And the court said yes, because remember, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Who executes the laws of the land? The president. So the court said that the president has the right to enforce the rights, the duties, and the obligations that come about as a result of the Constitution. In other words, he has the right to preserve the constitutional order. And obviously, if we have judges that go around being killed because there are some people who don't like what they, rule, that's upsetting of the rights, duties, and the constitutional order. And as the executor, the one who can execute the laws, the supreme law of the land, the president has the right to execute what needs to be done to preserve the constitutional order. Which leads to this president, who understood that, came later than that decision in 1890. But the decision was called In Re Nagel. But you can be sure that Teddy Roosevelt was well aware of that decision, and he comes forth and he says, I believe in the stewardship presidency. My view was that every executive officer, and above all, every executive officer in high position, was a steward of the people, bound actively and affirmatively to do all he could for the people, and not to content himself with the negative merit of keeping his talents undamaged in a napkin. I declined to adopt the view that what was imperatively necessary for the nation could not be done by the president unless he could find some specific authorization to do it. My belief was that it was not only his right, but his duty to do anything that the needs of the nation demanded, unless such action was forbidden by the Constitution or by the laws. In other words, the president can claim the silences of the Constitution and the laws, unless, of course, there's something in the Constitution or laws that says he can't do it. But if there's a hole in the Constitution or in the laws, this doctrine, this view of the presidency, which is a view that modern presidents really do espouse, says, I can act unless somebody tells me that I can't. And so what you get now is the modern presidency, a presidency that is a can-do presidency, as I pointed out, as a result of the transformation of the country and all the new laws that were passed that the president had to execute, including all the war and national security crisis that empowered the president, again, on the international stage, the delegation of power and the executive orders that can be done and issued as a result of delegation, the power to set the legislative agenda, the use of the media, the party leadership that can be used to control what goes on in Congress, and then, of course, what I've just talked about, the broad interpretations of the Constitution. So you go from the George Washington presidency, which basically said, domestically at least, the president is a clerk. You know, I'm just going to recommend things to Congress and they can do what they want with my recommendations, to a president that really decides pretty much everything. And the only thing that happens is Congress either agrees with the president or disagrees with the president, but the president really is the steward of the nation. So there you have it, okay? Now you know why President Trump can do some of the things he can do. You know why President Biden did some of the things he could do, and every other president before him, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, all of them, okay? Bush, the two Bushes, and now, of course, Donald Trump, and whoever succeeds him to the presidency. So I'll stop there, and your questions, please. I know, Barry, you were just taking to ask me something. Yeah. Yeah.
Where does selling Trump sneakers for $175 fit? Or
Yeah.
where does selling Trump bitcoins for millions of dollars,
Mhm.
the Farm Power Goal, where does that fit into this scheme?
Right. Well, it fits under the scheme, can your president do it? Okay, now some of this stuff is private things, you know, setting up private businesses. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the president can't run a business.
Could you summarize the
Sure.
question for the people on the
Sure.
screen?
And if you
I'll
can,
hold up, sorry.
you can do that. Barry is asking, where do all the things like bitcoins and, you know, sneakers, Trump sneakers and so forth, did you find anything? Right. Did you find anything in the powers of the presidency that says the president can't be a businessman on the side?
Jimmy Carter got rid of his peanut farm.
Well, I mean, you didn't find anything there. Now, Congress could pass a law, okay, and it has passed laws, okay, regarding what presidents can or can't do as private citizens. But somebody has to enforce that. Somebody has to bring a lawsuit, and lawsuits have been brought. We'll have to wait and see what is decided. Congress could also pass a law. Congress doesn't seem to be doing much about what the president is doing. So you do have these possibilities, but it depends on that. And then there's the other possibility, which I always reminded my students, and I remind you. You know, we talk about the checks and balances, the Supreme Court, the Congress, very important. What's the ultimate check and balance? You. That's why we have elections. You. That's the ultimate check and balance. Voting. And that's why democracies insist on voting, because that's the ultimate check and balance. And people kind of forget. You know, I looked at you, you didn't respond, but my students were like, I don't know. It's you. It's you. And that's a check and balance. And if you don't like what the Congress is doing or what the president is doing, or even what the court is doing, you vote. You vote for the other side or the other views. I mean, that's it. The president claims the silences of the Congress. It's very silent on what private businesses the president can have on the side. Okay? And there are some laws, they can be enforced. There are some laws regarding Congress, too. They can or cannot be enforced. And you're the ultimate enforcer if the institutions don't work properly. Yeah.
Wait for the microphone.
So thank you for speaking today. It was a wonderful, informative talk. You mentioned about checks and balances. That was my question, but because I've always believed that that's what keeps our country in balance. However, in the Constitution or in Congress or whatever, the president has the right to appoint the judges who preside over the courts.
Right.
And I used to believe that our Supreme Court was higher than the president, and the minds of the judges selected to serve on the Supreme Court really got to the court, were unbiased. But I don't feel that anymore. I feel like the Supreme Court is now simply just a puppet or lackeys of the president. And those appointments, I don't need to tell you, last a lifetime. So even if we vote, what's been done has been done. What can be done? And the courts also operate extremely slowly. So we'll be trying Trump's cases, I don't think you can after he's dead, but long after he's maybe out of office.
Right.
So where do we go?
Well, I mean, what you can vote for are presidents who you agree with that will fill the vacancies when they occur, okay? And that is a problem. But I should point out to you that this is not the first time that many people have voiced problems with the Supreme Court. The most infamous one was the Dred Scott decision, which many historians will tell you was a huge contributing factor to the Civil War. Dred Scott basically held that blacks were not people, okay, and that they could be traded as property. And it used some rather horrible language to reach that conclusion. That's why many professors like me hesitate to have the students read Dred Scott decision, because you'll read stuff in there that is really pretty awful. But so I only really talk about the result, and the result was that slaves were property. And that, of course, led to the Civil War. One of the reasons it led to, not the only reason, but one of the major reasons that provoked the Civil War. So the Supreme Court has not been necessarily the institution that saves the country. And for many people, not all people, but for many people, they believe this Supreme Court is maybe not as problematic as Dred Scott era, but comes close for many people. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, I just want to say one more thing about that. I'm sorry. I should tell you that there are some proposals to reform the Supreme Court, okay? One would be a constitutional amendment to do that, but that's very difficult. But there are other proposals like requiring justices who are appointed for life, okay, But they don't have to issue a decision. They could be put into retired status. So there are proposals for legislation to say that after you serve a certain number of years, you assume retired status. You're still a Supreme Court justice, but you're not exactly ruling on cases. There are other proposals I could go into, but of course these require agreement, support, awareness by people and legislators, and so right now we are where we are on the Supreme Court. Yes, sir.
President Biden approved the construction of a train tunnel under the Hudson River, which is necessary because a Hurricane Sandy, it was flooding the tunnel, and that tunnel could collapse. It is necessary to build a new tunnel for the economy and also the Second Avenue subway. President Trump, I don't know if it's legal for him that he terminated the project. He just said it's terminated. Is that decision can be considered illegal even though it is by the president, because it's in the national interest to have the construction? And money was approved by the Congress. Congress said that the tunnel was necessary. Congress is not perfect, but it was approved by President Biden. He made a decision on it. He visited the construction site. I know that Trump has the right to his opinion and to disagree with Biden's decision, but I want to get your feedback on this. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, you raised two things here. He's acting using an executive order, basically, okay? And so, again, I don't know what the underlying statute is under which he claims he can do that. So there is I'm sure if there isn't, I'm sure there will be a lawsuit to determine whether he has the authority, okay? So that's number one. In terms of withholding money, there are Supreme Court precedents that says that the president cannot impound. Impound means just hold the money back. When Congress approves it, it's got to be spent, okay? It arose during the Nixon administration. It's an old precedent. It's a little vague, but there's a precedent. The president can't just hold back the money. So there are lawsuits now proceeding under, whether the president has the authority to do this, and so we'll have to wait and see what the Supreme Court says about that. The other thing I should say about executive orders is that, yes, the president acts under the underlying statute, but executive orders are temporary. Understand that. A president will issue an executive order saying, I have the authority to do this because the statute underneath this order tells me I have the authority to do this, and so he does. But the next president can simply undo this and say, no, I don't want this to be done. I might have the authorization to do it, but I don't like it. Remember that you got to differentiate between the wisdom of a policy and the authority to make the policy. So if you have the authority, you can decide how to use it. And some people might believe it's unwise, okay? A subsequent president would say, okay, I do have the authority, but because what the prior president did, I think is unwise, I'm going to revoke that executive order. Okay, so it works that way. You always have to remember, separate the wisdom of a policy, whether you agree with it or not, from the authority to issue the policy. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Further on the same subject, it would seem that the Congress has the ability to erect a commission, for example, to carry out a law, as they have done with the Federal Reserve, for example, and many other departments of the government. And yet, so where does the idea of the unitary executive come from?
Okay.
And how does it, argue with that?
Right. Well, the unitary executive is a theory. It's not a fact. Okay, it's not something that, and it's certainly not recognized by a huge swath of legal scholars and politicians and so forth. It's a theory. The executive theory says that because the president is vested with the executive authority, nobody, not the Congress and not the courts, can challenge anything that the president does because of his executive authority. So it's unchallengeable, okay? The president will say, if he believes in this theory, I have the executive power, I'm carrying out whatever I'm carrying out, and it cannot be questioned, okay? That theory is simply a theory. It hasn't been approved by the Supreme Court. It certainly was not approved by the Supreme Court vis-a-vis Richard Nixon. It certainly wasn't approved by the Supreme Court vis-a-vis Clinton. And so far, it is simply a theory or a political point of view, if you want to phrase it that way. Okay? Basically, what it is what we've got, the framework we've got is I'm the executive. I can claim the gaps and the holes in statutes and the Constitution. And if nobody stops me, I've done it. That's basically where we are. If somebody stops me, then, then it's different. Yeah.
So that begs the question for me is what is permanent, what is not permanent? So executive orders can be reversed. Some of the decrees, like the tunnel, can be reversed. But what is permanent? You read, have read, this will be permanent. This will not be able to be reversed. Under what category of things that he is doing right now cannot be reversed?
Okay. So the short answer, which is glib and won't answer your question, but I'll say nothing is permanent. Nothing. Nothing that the government does is permanent. So that's the glib answer. But now let me break it out. Okay. An executive order is simply a policy, a decision issued by the president under an existing statute. The next president can decide to undo that and issue a different kind of rule, or no rule at all, okay? A statute is deemed to be permanent, but that's false. It's there until the next Congress decides to revoke the law. Now, the only reason people say it's permanent is because it's very difficult to pass a law. You've got to get it passed through the House, you've got to get it passed through the Senate, and you got to get the president to sign that law, okay? If you want to undo that law, like the Affordable Care Act, for instance, which is one big issue, it's not going to happen. Because what do you have to do? Okay, so the law was passed by the House, the Senate, and signed by, I guess it was Obama, right? If you don't like Obamacare, well, it's permanent because it's a law. If you don't like Obamacare, you've got to pass a new law that says Obamacare is void. So that has to be passed by the House, it has to be passed by the Senate, and it has to be signed by the president. The odds of that happening are very low. Can it happen? Can it happen? Yeah, it was tried, and of course, it didn't work. But that's why we speak of laws of Congress as being permanent. They can be overturned, they can be changed, but it's very hard to do so, even with something that has a large political support like, among some people, about getting rid of Obamacare. So it's permanent. That's why we say, but it's not. It's as permanent as can be. In terms of the Supreme Court, when a court issues a decision, that's the law of the land. Permanent. The court has ruled. Except that in subsequent cases, the court can issue tweaks to that precedent, cut things out at its edges, or, as we saw with the abortion ruling, simply overrule it, overrule what it said 50 years before, okay? So a Supreme Court decision is permanent because it's hard to do. You have to get a majority of the court that would be willing to either chip away or overturn it. And that's hard to do for two reasons. One is you've got to get the majority of justices, which might or might not be there to overturn. And secondly, although this court has not been observant of this principle, courts do not like to change the law very easily, for the very reason that law is supposed to be stable. People build relationships, economic relationships, human rights relationships, all kinds of things that you do. You do because you believe the law is going to be there tomorrow, okay? The same law is going to be there tomorrow. So you can predict, you can act, you can plan your business life, you can plan your personal life. You can do things because you believe that it's going to be there. So the principle is that to the extent that there is a law, whether it's bad or good, that the court has approved, You want it to be there and stay there so that people can plan their lives accordingly. But any Supreme Court can tweak the edges of any precedent or overturn it, as we saw with the abortion case not too far back. So the glib answer is nothing is permanent. But some things are harder to change than others. Some, okay? Yeah.
I'm right here. So,
Excuse me, take the mic, please.
What effect does the Supreme Court decision that a president cannot be charged with anything illegal during his term of office have on this concept of a unitary presidency?
Okay, well, the unitary presidency doesn't exist, okay? That's simply a point of debate. But it has a huge, the decisions that the president, the recent decision that the president cannot be charged with a crime, which is, there are exceptions. Actually, I could read you the, because I figured somebody would want to know a little bit about that. I'll give you the specific words of what was decided. But basically, if the president can't be accused of a crime and can't be prosecuted for a crime, that absolutely broadens the power of the presidency. Okay, it's an indirect broadening. It's not saying the president can do this, but what it's saying is, I can break the law, and I'm untouchable. So that is a huge grant of power to the president. Okay, and that is something that many people find totally objectionable. Okay, and you know, for the people who cheer this decision vis-a-vis the current president, I come back and say, what about the next president? Are you going to be overjoyed when that next president violates the law and you can't do a thing about it? Because the Supreme Court has said that the president is immune from prosecution. Okay, so I'm just hold on, my pages are a little confused. So let me see if I can find that case. And it builds on a prior case, so just give me a second. But in terms of enhancing the president's power, yeah, it's an absolute grant of power to the president. It means I don't even have to wait for gaps in the Constitution. I can just violate a law, okay? Now, you know, it'll be up to you to decide whether the president is going beyond gaps, and I think many people feel that this president has done so. Other people have felt that Biden has done so. But giving the president immunity is a huge grant of power to the president. Yeah. It's not the unitary presidency exactly, but it means that the president can act as he wishes. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
this has been very helpful because what it proves is that the norms that existed in terms of how people behaved.
The norms that existed, what, I'm sorry?
How presidents behaved in
Yeah.
terms of not having side gigs in terms of businesses.
Right.
Not changing the laws as you want to see them, is that this particular president is pushing every single button because he knows that his inability to do it is based on statutes and legal stuff that'll take years and years and years to change.
Right, and that's what I said.
And because
yeah.
the House is stacked, because the courts are stacked, Congress will do nothing. Because this particular president, the power of his personality and the fear he invokes creates a situation that even the voting rules are subject to being questioned and changed. And by the time they're potentially allowed to have the statutes and someone decides to change them, it could be years. So the damage that has been done will take decades to change, as opposed to the destruction that has occurred has taken 30 seconds in every day. But what you've done is illuminate why nothing happens, because for something to happen, it has to be Congress. And as long as this Congress is this Congress, nothing will be happen because everyone is afraid to do anything to challenge this man. And I appreciate the insight, and it underlines my frustrations why they're so incredibly deep.
Right. But also don't forget what I call the ultimate check and balance.
The ultimate check and balance is fine when you have basically challenging districts and voting rules.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and yes, but I hope, I mean,
Order basically standing
Right.
in line. That's a little bit of a strange reason why you can't
Right.
actually stand in line and vote.
right. I hear you, but I mean, I'm trying to explain to you what's happening, what's the underlying structure of what's happening and why. And then, you reflect the views of many people, no question about that. I have found, before the next question, I have found my notes on the presidential immunity. So here, it's really a three-part ruling, okay? The president possesses absolute immunity from criminal prosecution when exercising his core constitutional powers, okay? Let me just read, that's my paraphrasing. Here's the actual language. Congress cannot act on and courts cannot examine the president's actions on subjects within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. We thus conclude that the president is absolutely immune from criminal prosecution for conduct within his exclusive sphere of constitutional authority. So what does that mean? When the president has a specific power granted under Article 2, and he acts under this power illegally, can't be prosecuted. So what's an obvious example of things that have happened in the news? Just this past weekend, I was actually asked about it by Winds Radio, although I had to deal with another aspect of the case. The president has the absolute power to pardon.
I heard you
What?
on the radio. Yeah.
What, did you? Okay.
Very
What happens now, we don't have any, I don't mean to suggest this has happened because I don't have any evidence, so I'm just speaking theoretically. President has the absolute power to pardon. What if he accepts a bribe in order to pardon somebody? Congress cannot act on and courts cannot examine the president's actions on subjects within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. We thus conclude that the president is absolutely immune from criminal prosecution for conduct within his exclusive sphere of constitutional authority. Cannot prosecute him. Right? Now, for those of, so understand that. That's why I'm saying, I mean, I'm just reading what the court has said. It's for you folks to sort of decide how you understand that and how you feel about it and how you would feel about that under a different administration with whom you disagreed politically.
But we don't even know if people have the third administration.
Well, I won't go there, but we can talk about that. Now, that's the first part of the ruling, okay? If the president has conclusive power over something, he can act illegally. That's what the court has said, okay? So you have to understand the breadth of it. Now, where it's not, then it's a slightly different standards. In matters not involving his core constitutional powers, because, he has to deal with Congress sometimes, the president enjoys presumptive immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within the outer perimeter of his official responsibility. So if it's not one of these like direct powers, if it's sort of, part of his general responsibilities, as long as the illegal act occurred within the outer perimeter, it's presumptively okay. You can't criminally prosecute him, but it's a presumption. So it's a presumption. So you can bring a case against the president. He comes with the presumption that, you can't criminally prosecute him. You can rebut that presumption. And if you can, then yes, he can be prosecuted. But it's a hard thing to overcome because he has the presumption of immunity. That's the second part of the ruling. And then the third part of the ruling, which may go to what you were concerned about, Barry, it says that as for the president's unofficial acts, there is no immunity. So, for instance, his business activities, that's a unofficial act. Okay, so his business activities, Bitcoin, sneakers, whatever it is, you can certainly characterize that. A good prosecutor would characterize that. That has nothing to do with core constitutional responsibilities. It doesn't have anything to do with any kind of responsibility. And what the president is doing there violates some kind of criminal law. Okay, then you can go after him. So you can see what the strategy would be. The strategy would be, say it's not a core constitutional responsibility, it's one of these other responsibilities, so there's a presumption, we're going to rebut that, or try to characterize what the president has done as an unofficial act that has nothing to do with his office. But you could try that, but you understand that the way this is worded gives the president huge ability to violate the law. And so I always say to my friends who, believe that this was a good ruling for this president, how would you feel about a president with whom you disagree politically? You can't touch him. You can't touch him. Yeah.
I have a quick question about tariffs.
About what?
Tariffs.
Tariffs, yes.
And what I heard is that the president can say, okay, there's a tariff against aluminum, but he can carve out exceptions.
Mm-hmm.
Not for you, company A, not for you, company B. So a company might say, Mr. President, can I get one of those exceptions? And he might say, well, how much money have you donated to the Republican Party this week? Is that
That
okay?
goes in.